Donc aujourd'hui, on a le plaisir, l'honneur d'accueillir Francesco Gallino, qui est chercheur postdoctoral fellow, chercheur postdoctoral à l'Université de Turin. Ça marche, oui, je pense, dans le département de culture, société et politique. Il est spécialiste de pensée politique, histoire de la pensée politique. Il est par ailleurs donc le directeur en chef d'une revue importante en Italie qui est la Storia del pensiero politico. C'est un jeune chercheur, mais qui a déjà à son actif une bibliographie assez impressionnante. Il y a une ligne rouge dans la recherche de Francesco Gallino qui est la question de l'obéissance, de la subordination de l'obéissance, donc dans une perspective de longue durée. Il a écrit donc sur la boétie, évidemment c'est assez logique, mais il a travaillé aussi sur, et ça je pense que c'est son travail de thèse en fait, hein,
oui, c'est ça.
Sa thèse de doctorat, donc, qui porte sur Tocqueville, sorti en 2020, et c'est le Tocqueville des prisons. En fait, il faut rappeler que Tocqueville, quand il est allé aux États-Unis, il est parti aux États-Unis, donc il est parti parce qu'en fait, on a envoyé du Quai d'Orsay, hein, du ministère des Affaires étrangères, et c'était une mission qui visait justement à étudier le système carcéral des États-Unis. Il est revenu avec une expérience qui ensuite a donné lieu aussi évidemment aux travaux, donc notamment la démocratie en Amérique. Donc, voilà, donc cet intérêt pour l'obéissance ou la question de la subordination, et ensuite donc qui l'a amené à travailler récemment et travaille actuellement aussi sur Gustave Le Bon. Et donc il a sorti dans la foulée le livre donc sur Tocqueville, et ce livre récent, après je le fais circuler donc sur Le Bon. La traduction donc en français c'est Inconscient et politique chez Gustave Le Bon, et il continue de travailler sur des questions liées à l'inconscient, à l'intelligence, et toujours en essayant dans une perspective qui est la sienne, l'histoire de la pensée politique, mais en essayant toujours de trouver des interactions, des liens avec la neurologie, donc les sciences humaines. Les sciences du vivant. Moi, je le remercie vivement d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Par ailleurs, Francesco Gallino est le premier chercheur invité de la Maison des sciences de l'homme, qui est récent, comme vous savez. Donc, je pense que c'est une belle opportunité. En plus, voilà, ces recherches sont parfaitement cohérentes avec les axes de recherche de notre Maison des sciences de l'homme. J'espère qu'il y aura vraiment une belle synergie qu'on arrive à mettre en place. Déjà, donc, je pense qu'il y a toutes les bases. Merci beaucoup, Francesco. À toi la parole.
Merci. En premier lieu, merci à toi, Sandrolani, pour son invitation, et à la Maison des sciences de l'homme pour l'accueillance de ces semaines. Comme vous avez vu, ce séminaire va se tenir en anglais. Pour la loi universelle pour laquelle c'est mieux d'entendre de fautes linguistiques dans une langue qui n'est pas la nôtre. Mais bien sûr, on peut discuter de ce que je vais dire, en français après le talk. So I'm going to speak English, and thank you very much for being here, despite the problems with the trams, etc. And as far as I understood, the MSH has interdisciplinarity at its very scientific core. And so of course, thank you very much also for those who are connected online. And if there's a problem, I hope they can write or talk and say that. I hope they can hear me. And so I'm particularly glad to be talking about Gustave Le Bon, because I challenge you to find a modern author who is as contemporary, as interdisciplinary as Gustave Le Bon. You can start seeing that from the title of this talk, which is Can a Brainless Bird Fly? Ethology and Political Psychology in Gustave Le Bon. So we already have three different disciplinary axes, which are ethology, politics, and psychology. But that's just the beginning. Or is it? Okay. Here you see a selection of his main works. He published a lot of works, which was almost always a huge success in terms of sold copies. And as you see, he published on themes as different as smoking cigarettes. I wrote here La civilisation des Arabes, which has to do with ethnology, but also history of art, archaeology. Then there are Psychologie, politique et la défense sociale et Psychologie du socialisme, which are essays about politics. Then there is Psychologie de l'éducation, which is a pedagogic book, and there is L'équitation actuelle et ses principes, which is a horse riding handbook, which was really successful at the time. But things get even more strange. If you know all these things, I'm sorry, but I found that really interesting. He claimed to be a medical doctor. We are not sure whether he really got a degree or not, but he claimed to be a medical doctor. And oui, c'est pas moi. Okay. And in 1903, okay,
it's okay.
Okay. In 1903, he went really close to win the Nobel Prize in Physics, which happened to be a very famous Nobel Prize because it is the prize that was finally won by Pierre and Marie Curie. And for all his life, he believed that he would have deserved the prize, that the prize had been stolen from him. And even more strangely, he quarreled furiously via letter. We have all these letters, they're published, with Albert Einstein over who, him or Einstein, had invented the theory of relativity. And I believe it is quite uncommon to find a modern author which works on so many fields. It was probably, that's your field, I mean, but that was probably more common in the 16th, 17th century. I think to René Descartes, no, but we are at the end of 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. It is quite uncommon to find such an author. Anyway, if we are still talking about Gustave Le Bon, this isn't, of course, for his works about smoking cigarettes, etc. That's for his most famous book, which is Psychologie du Foule, which was published in 1895, and which is one of his shortest books. It is very rhetoric. It is a very powerful writing style. It is a sort of pamphlet discussing, and it is, of course, that's well known, announcing, like in a prophecy, the coming of popular masses on the stage of history, the coming of what will be later be called mass society. It is, of course, very famous. It says, les sociétés qui succéderont à la nôtre auront à compter avec une puissance nouvelle, dernière souverain de l'âge moderne, la puissance des foules. Et encore, ce n'est plus dans les conseils des princes, mais dans l'âme des foules, que se préparent les destinées des nations. So, this is a very famous prophecy, and of course, this new main character of political and social history, which is masses, which is fools, which is crowds in English, behaves and reasons and thinks and acts in a different way than all the previous most important actors, which are kings, which are governors, which are aristocracies. And so these works, Psychologie des Foules' goal is to unveil, to understand how masses, how crowds act, reason and think. I'll take 5 minutes to talk about his main thesis, even if I know that's well known, but that's useful to recall what Le Bon means when he speaks of crowd. Le Bon talks about psychological crowd, so full psychology, and he uses that as a very technical terms. Imagine a group, some people grouped in the same place, for instance, this room, for instance, a street, for instance, a square, or some people who are not physically grouped, but they are mentally linked because they are doing exactly the same thing. For instance, they are reading the same article on the same newspaper in the same morning. Well, of course, they can go on being what they are, so individuals doing the same things or being in the same place, or there is a sort of switch that can be turned on. And if you turn on the switch, they stop being individuals and they become something else. They become a unique subject, governed by a unique mind, the same mind for everyone. And that phenomenon is called psychological crowd, full psychology. Why is that? According to Le Bon, everybody has, everyone's mind is divided in two parts, the conscious and the unconscious part. We are at the end of 19th century, we are a little bit before Freud, but people are starting to discuss a lot the items of unconscious. And so that's a very simple scheme. You have the conscious part, which is the part you are in touch with, you can easily know, which is your free will, the things you actually think. And then there is the unconscious, which is the deepest part, the part with which it is more difficult to get in touch with, the part of us that we do not really know. According to Le Bon, this part, so the unconscious part itself, it's divided in two. There is the individual unconscious, which is the unconscious that everybody acquires, gains during his life. Something very important, very bad, for instance, happens to us when we are children, when I am a child. And so this is going to influence my unconscious for all my life. But then there is collective unconscious. And collective unconscious is something that I did not acquire during my individual life, but it's something that is shared with everybody of my group. For instance, Le Bon thinks in terms of people, of national people. So if I'm Italian, I share my common unconscious, my collective unconscious with all Italian people. And if I'm from Turin, as I am, I share even more collective unconscious with people of my town, etc. So what happens when the switch is turned on? The individual personalities of everyone temporarily disappear. It vanishes. Everything that I am, that I studied, that I believe in, that I know, the people I've met, everything disappears. So what remains is what is beneath individual personalities in every person which is becoming part of that crowd. So the collective unconscious. Am I making myself clear?
Yes.
Okay.
It's clear, yes.
Okay. So this mind, this collective mind, which is called collective unconscious, or people's soul, there are many terms, but we will use collective unconscious, has some characteristics which are different from individual mind. A crowd, a psychological crowd, is not rational, meaning that it cannot choose a goal and then pursue it. Think about the tools, the means in order to gain what it wants. It can do that. Of course, a crowd acts. It makes things. It can kill somebody, so horrible things. It can defend a city, even if it is outnumbered from the enemies. So heroism, heroic acts. It can destroy a public building, so do stupid things. So it is a collective subject which makes things, but it cannot decide what to do. It cannot reason, choose a goal, and then pursue it. And a crowd cannot distinguish true, false, and fake. So that questions a tradition, which I think goes back at least to the Roman Empire, which is that if I want to know what happened somewhere, I ask to many wisdoms. And if they all give me the same account, then I think that I have a proof that I know what happened. Le Bon says, absolutely not, because the collective mind has no idea what's really happening. So everybody will tell you something happened. This does not tell you that this actually happened, because a crowd cannot distinguish true and false. So a crowd does not act rationally. But this does not mean that it acts randomly. Okay? It's exactly the opposite. There is a logic under the crowd's behavior. And Gustave Le Bon's goal is to understand this logic, this peculiar logic, which is the logic of the crowd. So the question is, how does this collective mind work? Or in any terms, in different terms, what is collective unconscious? And here is where ethology, animals, and biology comes in. A very brief detour. There is a beautiful book by a specialist which works and lives here in Bordeaux, who is Barbara Stigler, about Friedrich Nietzsche and biology. Perhaps you know that, I suppose. And in this book, she says something that I found extremely interesting, which is that Friedrich Nietzsche, especially late Nietzsche, talks about biology a lot. I'm sorry if you know these things, but I need this to go back to Gustave Le Bon. And she says, Nietzsche talks about biology a lot, and readers, interpreters, normally read this lexicon as metaphors, as vitalistic symbols of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical theories. On the contrary, Friedrich Nietzsche, late Nietzsche, so the Nietzsche of his later works, read and engaged deeply and seriously with the science of its times. And so when he talks about biology, we should not consider that as metaphors, but we should understand that he's literally meaning what he is saying. So I find it very interesting, and I find it to be exactly true for Gustave Le Bon. Le Bon engages himself a lot with science. He discusses about animals. He especially talks about nervous systems of higher vertebrates. And it is necessary to look at these writings in order to understand what he means with collective unconscious. So in order to understand how does a crowd think. And this is even programmatically written in his first important book. This is a quotation I mainly put for you, because in his first book of 1881, so 14 years before Psychologie, the full, I always wrote the quotations both in English and the original French. He said that in order to understand human psychology, human history, human cultures, okay, it is important to study the study of mental faculties in animals. And he says, unfortunately, this is a study which psychologists have always believed to be beneath them and which they have not yet paid much attention to. So in a programmatic way, in order to study human psychology and human history, you have to look at animals. Why? According to Gustave Le Bon, and of course, I'm going to talk about biology, I'm not really sure what, I have no idea what is correct and what is incorrect from a scientific point of view. That's not my job, of course. I am interested in the philosophical background and meaning of all I'm going to say. So I hope I'm sorry if I give you a fake biology, but according to Gustave Le Bon, we have two different nervous systems, the spinal cord and the brain. The brain is the more recent, more evolved organ. The spinal cord is the more ancient one. Why old and new, etc.? Because Gustave Le Bon is an evolutionist. He reads Darwin, he quotes Darwin, he claims to be a Darwinist, and he is absolutely not a Darwinist. He has a much older evolutionism. He believes in what was called recapitulative embryology. Simply put, this means that every living being evolves. Every living species evolves. If they don't, they die out. But while they evolve, they maintain a trace of the previous generations, a trace of the past, of their previous versions written inside their body, physically written inside their body. So that's why evolved vertebrates high vertebrates, mammals, birds, humans, apes, of course, etc., has the brain, but also have the spinal cord, which is the ancient version of the brain. How do these organs work? The brain is a centralized nervous system. Its goal is to introduce a temporal gap between the external stimulus and how we react to the external stimulus. So we see something and we have a very brief moment in which we compare what we are seeing with all our previous experiences. And then we choose how to react. The spinal cord is exactly the opposite. It is a non-centralized nervous system. It is spread all over the body. And its duty is to answer to an external stimulus without any need for the stimulus to be centralized to arrive to the brain. So I put my hand on fire. Of course, that's hot. And my hand is able to just, my spinal cord in the hand is able to say to the hand, put the hand away. So you put the hand on fire and then you do like this. And the hotness does not need to go to the brain. And of course, this is very important because you save time. Is it clear? I know that's all of this sounds strange, but my claim is that it is absolutely necessary in order to understand the political and social Gustave Le Bon. And that's exactly like Friedrich Nietzsche. This is absolutely necessary. He literally means what he says while he's talking about biology. So it is important to understand, okay, my hand, the spinal cord in my hand knows, is capable to recognize hotness and so put the hand away. But how did it learn that hotness is bad? How did it learn to do like this? By repetition. This means that the first time we receive an external stimulus we have never met before, we don't know what to do, so we react randomly. Let's imagine I am an antelope, I am in the savannah, and for the first time in my life I see a big cat over there, a big cat with hairs around the neck, a big mouth, big teeth, and of course I don't know what it is. I have never seen a big cat in my life, and so I react somehow. I can choose to just stay there and eat the grass I'm eating, and of course if that's my choice, that's the last time I see a big cat in the savannah. Or I can choose to run away, and of course that's a better decision from an evolutionist point of view, because of course I have much more possibilities to survive to meeting a lion. Okay, so if I survive and if I make this experience many times, so I meet the lion, run away, I repeat the experience. After a certain couple of times, my spinal cord, it's moelle épinière, I hope that's clear in fact, okay? My spinal cord memorizes the link between the stimulus and the reaction. From that point on, I see the lion and I don't need to choose what to do. My body automatically run away by seeing the lion. I have memorized an automatic behavior or a reflex. These are all synonyms for Gustave Le Bon. Okay, but that's just me. I learned to run from the lion, but my son, my daughter will have to learn again to run from the lion. And so they will risk to be eaten by the lion. But if my daughter, my son, etc., my antelope son, my antelope daughter, make the same experience, and so memorize the same automatism, after a few generations, my grandchildren, my granddaughter will not have to learn it again, because the automatism will enter in the hereditary pattern. So my species will have gained a useful automatism, and that will become something you are born with. Is everything clear? Okay. So this is what we call instincts for animals, and this is what we call collective unconscious for humans. Collective unconscious is the set of all the automatic behaviors that we have inherited from our ancestors, from our human ancestors, and from our not human ancestors, so before we evolved in humans. So, okay, let's read Le Bon. Les actes réflexes finissent par s'associer d'une façon automatique quand ils ont été répétés un assez grand nombre de fois. Lorsque l'association se continue pendant plusieurs générations, elle devient héréditaire et les actes produits sous son influence ont reçu le nom d'actes instinctifs. En fait, l'instinct n'est guère que la résultante d'un sentiment héréditaire inconscient. Et encore, in English, it's the principles I have just outlined are absolutely general. They apply to the education of man as well as to the acquisition of the instincts of animals and to the formation of the characters of people, which are really only instincts. So, there is no difference between how animal instincts are developed, human instincts are developed, people's characters, people meaning nations' characters are developed. It's a one and only memorization system. And this tells us already something about the crowd. Because normally, when it comes to axiology, when it comes to what's good and what's bad, readers, interpreters, scholars say, okay, for Gustave Le Bon, the crowd is irrational. It can do horrible things. It has no idea what it's doing. It cannot distinguish the true, the false, the fake. So that's the problematic side of the story, the bad side of the story. And if we want to put our hopes somewhere on a political ground, for instance, we have to put them on the individual, because the individual can somehow be rational, can in some ways act in an informed way, can choose in a way that has some sense. Of course, it is not sure that he will, but it is possible that he will. On the contrary, the crowd cannot do that. And so the aim is to govern the crowd, to deal with the crowd. On the contrary, what we just said helps us to question this approach, because automatic behaviors are developed only if they work, of course, because if an automatic behavior, if a link between a stimulus and a reaction does not work, is not effective, of course, it does not become hereditary from a basic evolutionist point of view. So, intelligence of the crowd becomes more interesting than for a lot of time Le Bon has been read. Of course, there's not all the readers, all the interpreters, but anyway, that's the scheme. The crowd is governed by the spinal cord. That's something Le Bon says of course, I'm reading Le Bon through all his works. This is something which is much more evident in other works than in Psychologie the Fool. But you can see that also if you read Psychologie the Fool by knowing the other works by Le Bon, which is something that Le Bon says in every possible way that you have to do. He says, you have to read Psychologie the Fool in light of my other works. It is not self-reliant. It is not, this is just a resume of my ideas, says Le Bon in Psychologie the Fool. So, if you do that, if you read Psychologie the Fool in light of Le Bon's ethological, ethnological, medical writings and psychological writings, of course, you find these things in Psychologie the Fool too. He says the crowd, for instance, is medullary. It's governed by the spinal cord, and that's the exact case in which what Barbara Stiegler says about Nietzsche should be applied, because normally we think that's a metaphor. But if Le Bon spent books and books talking about spinal cord, why should that be a metaphor? So the crowd is governed by automatic behaviors. The individual, on the contrary, has both. It has automatic behaviors and it has the brain or encephalus. So the conscious part, what we, in a simple way, what we might call the free will, the possibility of choosing. And so the question becomes, where does the line, the border between spinal cord and brain run? Which acts are governed by the spinal cord in humans and which acts are governed by the brain? Which is like asking, in which acts are we free? And in which acts are we simply determined by all the automatic behaviors we have inherited from our ancestors? That's something that Gustave Le Bon repeats more and more times. We are essentially what our ancestors made us. We are essentially driven by our ancestors' memories written in us. So that's, I only made some quotations, but that is literally everywhere in Le Bon, the reference to the importance of the ancestors in how we behave. So the first hypothesis, which I think it would be normally to make, is that the first assumption is that since spinal cord is the simpler, more ancient organ, and brain is the more evolved nervous system, then the spinal cord deals with simple actions, and brain encephalus deals with more complicated actions. But that's not the case. And that's where I gained the title of this talk, which is, can a brainless bird fly? Or, as I said here, zombie birds. Because Le Bon writes, when an animal is deprived of the superficial part of its cerebral hemispheres, the senses do not cease to function, but it has lost all will. His movements are those of a sleeping animal. It flies if you throw it in the air. It walks if you push it. Eats if you put food in his mouth, because the excitations in the sense organs determine automatic motor reactions, whose seat is in the spinal cord. You have the French, you also have the French. So I usually find a little bit funny this experiment, the idea of a bird without a part of his head, which is thrown in the air and can fly. I find it a little bit funny because I'm absolutely sure that Le Bon never really performed such an experiment. But of course, that's interesting. Why can a bird fly without his brain? Because his wings memorized how to fly. So if you throw him in the air, the wings feel the air, and so they perform the flight. And so the point is, even very complicated actions can be performed automatically. And we are discussing this about animals, but we might discuss this about humans too, thanks to an experiment in late 19th century, which was very common in late 19th century France, which had nothing to do with cutting heads, and which was hypnotism. There were a lot of experiments with hypnosis in the late 19th century France. And these experiments, which Le Bon read, etc., talks about people who are, while asleep, while in the hypnotic sleep, they are said things like, when you wake up, you will run around this room. Or when you wake up, you will sing a song very loudly. And then the person wakes up and it runs or it sings a song very loudly. And if you ask him or her, why are you doing so? They say, well, I just wanted to sing a song. And of course, that's not true. They are doing that because they have been told to do that when their brain was asleep. Let's read Le Bon. The facts observed during natural somnambulism and during hypnotism prove to us that the most complicated intellectual acts, and which seem to require most of the intelligence of consciousness, can be performed in an entirely automatic manner. So we have a problem, of course, which is not only the most complicated intellectual acts can be performed automatically, but even we do not know if our acts are automatic or are subject to free will, because people who have been hypnotized do not realize they are acting automatically. So, I don't know if what I'm doing here is clear. I'm trying to understand what's the role of reason and what's the role of automatic behavior. Which human acts are governed by the reason, by the brain, by free will, and which acts are governed by all the instincts that we have developed in our history. Is it clear what I'm doing, or I should explain it in a better way?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, the simple, complicated scheme that didn't work. We might make a second hypothesis. This hypothesis is, okay, even very complicated acts can be performed automatically. But as the brain is the most evolved, the most developed nervous system, and humans, in Le Bon's view, are the most evolved, the most developed beings on Earth, then we might imagine that the most typically distinguishedly human actions require brain, require reason, require consciousness. And this is a better hypothesis, because many specialists who shared this general approach thought so. Pierre Janet was an enormously important French psychologist who was the specialist on psychological automatism. And he wrote in 1880, "Is not the act of genius the freest thing in the world?" Meaning, act of genius, art, science are the exact opposite of automatic behavior. And he was studying automatisms. And in a similar way, Vilfredo Pareto, Italian sociologist, in 1916, while discussing the difference between logical actions, which means conscious, rational actions, and automatic, non-conscious, unconscious actions, he says, logical actions are very numerous among civilized people. The operations of the arts and sciences belong to this class. So both Janet and Pareto considered genius, science, art as the opposite of automatism. But this doesn't work with Le Bon. Le Bon, on the contrary, believes that art and science are exactly the kind of actions which are performed automatically. And I like to read this quotation because I find it quite incredible, because at the end of the 19th century, he's basically talking about computers. I read it in English, but of course, if you read, you can read the French, which is better. The writer, the poet, the inventor have only to transcribe the fruits of the unconscious activity of their mind. So writer, poet, inventor, art, science. This work can be compared to that of an individual who, in order to solve a problem with a calculating machine, whose mechanism he does not know, has only to put certain numbers at one end of the machine and to put it into play, to see immediately appear at its other end the combinations of numbers forming the solution solved. So at the end of the 19th century, he's saying poets and inventors are like those who put the data into the machine, we would say into the computer, and the data might be everything they studied, all the works of art they have seen in their life, okay? And then wait for the result at the other side, the machine being their nervous system, and they have no control and no idea of what's going on, why they invent or why they perform art. So, we started from the crowd, which is irrational, governed by automatic behaviors, by collective unconscious. And the individual, the single person who can be rational, who can reason, who can think, who can choose. But this difference is vanishing, is fading, while we see how much part of individual life is controlled by automatic behaviors. And this might even not be a problem from a personal point of view, because we don't know if what we are doing is chosen or is automatic. And automatic behaviors, as we said, proved to work very well. So on an individual level, we might just accept this. But on a political level, we have an enormous problem, because if we do not have free will, if we do not have the possibility to choose, if we do not have the possibility to act in a way which is not determined by our past, how can we influence a society? How can we influence the politics? How can we perform a political action? How can we influence and govern the crowds? And I find it fascinating that in Gustave Le Bon, we find a possible answer. It should be said that in his first book, the 1881 book, he says, everything I'm writing has two goals. Formulating an art of government and formulating an art of education. He never really published an art of government. At least I'm basically talking about, that's something important that I should have said before. I'm basically talking about Gustave Le Bon until 1910. There is a very late Le Bon, which starts from 1911, which is a little bit different, which has read Sigmund Freud, which deals with contemporary items in a slightly different manner. So we should change our paradigms. It is not completely different, but it's, I mean, that's a little bit more complicated. But if you take the Gustave Le Bon until in the biggest part of his intellectual life, and these two parts are separated in 9 years in which he didn't write anything about soil sciences, etc. But okay, in the Gustave Le Bon I'm talking about, in the universe of his thought, he never managed to write a detailed art of government, a detailed politic handbook or text. On the contrary, he wrote a very detailed art of education, which is la Psychologie de l'éducation, which was a huge success, etc. And what does he say here? I have no idea what time is it, but okay. Let's read Le Bon. Quelle que soit la connaissance à acquérir, parler une langue, monter à bicyclette ou à cheval, jouer du piano, peindre, apprendre une science ou une art, le mécanisme est toujours le même. Il faut, au moyen d'artifices divers, faire passer le conscient dans l'inconscient par l'établissement d'associations qui engendrent progressivement des réflexes. So you see, we are in 1902, and we are still in the exact same paradigm of 1881. We are inside the paradigm of repetition, which brings reflexes, which brings you automatic behaviors that you acquire. And that's pedagogy. That's exactly like the antelope with seeing the lion and learning that she has to escape. So every human, every living being, at least every vertebrate who learns something, who learns how to do something, it learns it in the same exact way. It learns it by repetition and by transforming something external in something written in his body, written in his spinal cord, by linking some external stimulus to a gesture he has to perform without thinking about it. But, so that's exactly what we discussed in these 45 minutes. But what we have here is a potential role for reason. Reason does not allow you to perform an act in a good way. You cannot ride a bike if you think about it. You cannot play the piano. You cannot learn science by thinking about it, by wanting to, by reason. But what you can do with reason is training yourself, starting engaging in the process of repetition. So you actively decide to repeat something until it becomes an automatic behavior. And of course, that's a political importance, because you can do it to yourself, but Le Bon is talking about national education system in France. So if you influence education of people, you rationally influence their automatic behavior. So that's when you govern the crowd, not when the crowd is a crowd, but when you act on what automatic behaviors they learn. When you influence their automatic behaviors. Okay? Okay. I still have 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes perhaps.
10 minutes?
No, 5, 10.
5, 10?
Yeah, it's 3.
Okay. Okay. I read the second quotation here. Le bicycliste, le pianiste, l'écuyère, qui se souviennent de leur début, se rappellent par quelles difficultés ils sont passés, les efforts inutiles de leur raison, tant que les réflexes nécessaires n'étaient pas prêts. Leur application consciente ne leur donnait ni l'équilibre sur la bicyclette ou le cheval, ni l'habileté de doigts sur le piano. Ce n'est que quand, par des répétitions d'associations convenables, des réflexes ont été créés et que le travail est devenu inconscient, qu'ils ont pu monter sans difficulté à la bicyclette et à cheval, ou jouer du piano. So you see, reason makes unuseful efforts at the beginning, but it is necessary in order to acquire that ability. So everything would work if it wasn't for a detail, which is, okay, that's the scheme I suggested you. Reason does not supervise complex activities, but it consciously and rationally initiates the process that enables the desired automatism to be acquired. I hope that's clear. Okay, and everything would work if it wasn't for languages. Le Bon is scandalized, he's outraged about how languages are taught in France. He says, any child who moves in a foreign country, he learns the foreign language in 6 months without studying that, just interacting with the linguistic environment. On the contrary, here in France, students study a language for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, then they go out of the lycée and they barely speak that language. They need a dictionary in order to translate Greek, Latin, German, English. That's a fraud, he says. So what should we do? And he suggests we should try to replicate the experience of that child being in a foreign country. And he says, notre méthode repose sur notre principe général de substituer le plus rapidement possible le travail inconscient au travail conscient. Ah. Bon. Et je ne lui ai ajouté que le fait de choisir des livres tellement captivants que l'élève les lise par curiosité et n'est pas conséquemment à faire aucun travail fastidieux. So the point is, give the pupil some books he's really interested in. Probably today he would say, give the pupil some TV series he's really interested in. So he forgets his learning. So you see, there's a slight difference. There's a slight difference between what he said before and what he's saying now. Before he said, il faut faire passer le conscient dans l'inconscient. So it's the content which must become unconscious. Here it's substituer le travail inconscient au travail conscient. So it's the process of learning which has to be unconscious. Not only the content, riding a bike, speaking the languages, the language must become unconscious. But we have to forget this, the fact itself that we are learning. Reason is both a tool, because it enables the memorization of automatisms, and an obstacle, because it makes more difficult to memorize automatisms. And this leads, I think, to some strange aspects, political aspects of Gustave Le Bon, because as you know, Gustave Le Bon is a far-right thinker, he's a right-wing thinker, he's a conservative, he's a nationalist. He's one of the most right-wing thinkers we study in social sciences, I think. And nevertheless, when he talks about pedagogy, he has an incredibly libertarian pedagogy. He says the child has to be as free as possible because since he's interested in what he's learning, he forgets that he's learning, and so he learns quicker. And even in politics, even if he's a conservative, he's an anti-Dreyfusard, etc., he's not in favor of Caesarism, Bonapartism, elitist governance, etc., but he's in favor of suffrage universal, of universal right. Of course, it's not universal, it's male universal rights, and we might discuss that, of course. But that's interesting because he says we have to rely on universal suffrage. Why? Because people will vote rationally, because they know what they're doing? No, because they vote irrationally. And so votes are a way to consult the collective unconscious. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to end by saying that all these contradictions, which I find to be interesting, useful contradictions, are displayed in the best way possible in L'Équitation actuelle, which is the horse riding handbook he wrote in 1892, so 2 years before La Psychologie de Fou. The man you see in this picture is Gustave Le Bon, who employed a very sophisticated, a very new technique of photographic technique in order to explain the gestures riders had to do. Le Bon's goal in this book was to democratize horse riding, mainly because if more French people were able to ride a horse well, on a military level, it would be easier to defend from Germany. It is slightly more complicated than this, but not so complicated. And so what does he say? And I read this quick quotation. Par suite de la répétition, l'obéissance au langage du chevalier deviendra de moins en moins hésitant, de plus en plus instinctif, etc. Et sera automatique. So we are, just to show you that we are still in the same old paradigm of memorizing automatic behaviors. But what does he say in this book? In the first half of this book, Le Bon says, teaches us how to lead the horse to be the most obedient horse in the history. The horse must obey everything you tell him. The rider thinks to a command, and the horse must respond immediately. So it is almost obsessive in talking about how much this horse must be obedient. Then we come to the second part of the handbook. And here Le Bon explains the rider how it should ride. And he says, if the horse is walking, it's better not to give him any command, because he knows what he's doing, he's just walking, so leave it to the horse. If there is an obstacle and the horse has to jump the obstacle, he knows how to jump it. If you give him a command, he might get confused. So don't give him any command, leave it to the horse. If the ground is a little bit bumpy, it's better not to give a command to the horse because he knows what he's doing. Leave it to his instinct. And if the horse is falling, well, that's the case in which you never have to give a command to the horse because it would confuse him. So we have this big paradox of Le Bon from one side explaining how to make this horse the most obedient horse in the history of horses. And on the other side, he says the rider to never give a command to the horse. And this peculiar thing, this paradox we have in this book explains a lot of things. I think it doesn't explain them, but it shows some peculiarities. And it does come back to an experience Le Bon talks about that he had when he was in India. He was riding a horse, he misunderstood the local language, and instead of telling the horse to go slow, he told him to go as fast as he could. So the horse started running as fast as he could in a crazy run. And for 2 hours, Le Bon was terrified because he was running in bouncy grounds into the woods, but he understood that if he gave any command to the horse, they would both have died because he would confuse the horse. And so after 2 hours, they arrived at the town they were meant to arrive without any hurt. And I think these images gives us something because of Le Bon of its age, because that's the period in which popular masses are rising. And it's the period in which unconscious is being discovered. And of course, Le Bon and his peers fear popular masses, and they fear unconscious. But they are also discovering that trying to govern too much the popular masses, try to keep the unconscious down inside, are potentially more problematic choices than leading to the horse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very rich talk. The question time is open. If you have questions, it's a very, yeah, I have questions, but
in which language?
Manon, yeah.
In which language shall we
Français, ça va?
En français, c'est cool, c'est ok.
Moi, j'ai plein de questions.
Alors, vas-y, allez.
C'était un question.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. J'ai découvert qu'il y avait une pensée de la pédagogie chez Gustave Le Bon. J'avoue que je l'ignorais complètement. Donc, c'est bien, ça fait des nouvelles choses à lire. Alors, j'ai plusieurs questions. Alors là, oui, une des questions qui est à la fois une question et une remarque, c'est que dans mes recherches, je m'intéresse un peu à la psychologie sociale, à la psychologie collective, et souvent je me suis demandé quel était vraiment l'apport de Le Bon par rapport à Gallino, par rapport à Sigéné. Et en fait, là, j'ai l'impression que peut-être ce qu'on pourrait répondre, c'est qu'il a relu des questions, sans citer ses sources, il a relu des questions d'auteurs précédents à travers peut-être une réflexion sur l'éthologie et sur la réflexion sur l'animal, en fait, et cette question du cerveau et de la moléculière. C'est peut-être ça son apport par rapport à toutes les questions. Finalement, parce que la plupart des concepts qu'il utilise, c'est pas lui qui les a inventés.
C'est l'originalité, en gros.
Oui, voilà. Est-ce que son originalité, c'est ça?
Ou bien donc c'est quelqu'un qui recycle.
Voilà, c'est ça. C'était un peu ma question. Et si vous avez un éclairage là-dessus.
Première question.
Je ne sais pas si on enchaîne une question.
Ouais, tu veux répondre tout de suite?
Non, on peut
faire, ouais, on peut faire un premier tour de questions, si vous voulez. Alexandre?
Oui, moi j'ai trouvé intéressant le moment où tu as parlé de cette expérience où donc l'oiseau est dépourvu d'une partie de son cerveau, et du coup, pour Le Bon, c'est la mise en évidence qu'il y a des mécanismes qui fonctionnent automatiquement. Est-ce que au niveau de ses sources, est-ce que cette idée de deux systèmes nerveux, c'est quelque chose qu'il a, disons, inventé lui-même, ou est-ce qu'il se base sur des auteurs qui ont soit formulé déjà un peu ça, ou un produit des expériences qui lui ont fait penser ça donc, à Le Bon, au sujet de ces deux systèmes nerveux? Quelles sont un peu ces sources ou les auteurs qui convoquent pour faire cette distinction?
Christopher, question?
Oui, plusieurs, mais en fait, c'est probablement mieux
de
demander peut-être une seule question à la fin.
À la fin, ouais, ok. Moi aussi, j'ai plusieurs questions, mais peut-être. La question pour moi, c'est la question du génie que tu as évoqué. Quel est le génie des foules et en quoi consiste la capacité créatrice des foules? Dans quelle création elle se manifeste, quoi? Parce que quels sont les exemples concrets d'un génie collectif? Parce que si les génies, justement, n'est plus la prérogative d'un individu, mais d'un collectif, en quoi ce génie collectif est-il productif et en quoi et qu'est-ce qu'il produit? C'est une première question. Après, j'ai plusieurs questions. Sonia?
D'abord, merci. Merci pour la
Merci à vous.
Moi, j'ai plutôt une question liée à ce que Alexandre disait par rapport aux sources. Est-ce que j'ai bien compris? Il a lu Darwin, mais il n'était pas d'accord. Ça, c'est.
En fait, c'est comme tout le France.
Il y a une question de réception française.
Oui, le France n'est pas en fait darwiniste, en fait.
Non, parce qu'il y a une tradition plus ancienne, c'est ça.
La marque.
La marque, c'est la marque, bien sûr.
Mais c'est intéressant, oui, il comprend tout à fait bien le texte,
mais
jamais appliqué.
Il n'y arrive pas parce que ça, c'est une question d'inconscient. Hein.
Oui, vraiment, oui, parce que pour moi, les anthropologistes, oui, c'est toujours une question difficile à comprendre.
Ouais. C'est l'inconscient culturel, on pourrait dire.
Oui, apparemment, oui. Mais c'est dépassé par le marque. Mais aujourd'hui, on a le retour de marque épigénétique.
Oui.
Voilà. C'est en fait.
La vengeance.
Oui, oui.
The revenge. Ouais, c'est ça le truc. Donc, on fait la réception de Darwin et son rapport avec Darwin, qui est un rapport apparemment non linéaire ou conflictuel, disons comme ça. Oui, voilà. Donc, il y a déjà une très riche.
Oui, about this, I think.
If you want, après, quand tu veux.
Oui. En général, l'idée à propos de cet aspect de l'évolution, apparemment, presque tout en fait en France, il comprend l'évolution comme une sorte de moyen d'acquérir des caractères, en fait, physique, réalité. Et donc, ça c'est intéressant. Ça veut dire que c'est pas en fait, il n'y a pas de notion pas du tout de gène, mais en fait, c'est plutôt les caractères acquis, ça veut dire par l'apprentissage. Et le darwinisme est plutôt la synthèse avec les génétiques qui était dans les années 30, en fait, du XXe siècle. Il y a une division entre les deux. On ne peut pas hériter les caractères acquis. Et voilà. Ici, c'est clair qu'il a cette idée. C'est le marque, encore une fois.
Ben oui.
Et je trouve ça intéressant. J'ai aussi trouve cette notion de prise de mot race, en fait. Parce qu'à la fin, les races, il parle pour les civilisés et les autres. Ça aussi, c'est un concept de cette période. Et ça change aujourd'hui, en fait, encore une fois.
C'est clair.
Pour en fait, inclure les gens dits non civilisés ou non de couleur, et sur le monde, dire, ah oui, c'est comme les autres. Ils ont des idées, ils ont un concept d'histoire. Voilà. Et ça, c'est aussi pour le 19e siècle, je trouve ça intéressant. C'est toujours accepté. Et c'est dans le domaine de philosophie, en biologie aussi. Le race, c'est quelque chose, et aussi en Italie, je crois, le race est une chose, en fait. C'est quelque chose qui était accepté comme un élément d'étude. C'est-à-dire comme les autres, en fait.
Bah oui, donc c'est pas
les autres caractères, on a une race qui est derrière tout, en fait.
Je pense qu'il y a aussi une influence dombrosienne, je ne sais pas si parce que justement la question de race, qui n'a pas évidemment la connotation actuelle, bien entendu, donc c'est quelque chose qui est je pense qu'il y a une dimension aussi anthropologique, justement, lombrosienne. Je ne sais pas donc quels sont les rapports avec Lombroso et l'école turinoise, notamment, hein, qui développe beaucoup dans la deuxième moitié du XIXe siècle la question des caractères héréditaires liés aux ratios, en quelque sorte, en étudiant notamment l'éthique du sud de l'Italie. Le terrain, donc l'anthropologie sociale italienne, est le sud récemment conquis par les Piémontais et acquis dans l'État unitaire. C'est là donc leur terrain. Il y a des photos, des daguerreotypes incroyables, des brigands tués, des mis de profil, Parce que donc, ce qu'ils étudient, c'est le caractère héréditaire. Et ça, c'est notre.
C'est l'ambrosio.
Lombroso. Antonio.
Si.
Antonio Lombroso. Donc, il y a aussi.
C'est cette notion de
criminel, bien sûr, oui. La foule criminelle, donc Sigele. Non?
C'est pas Antonio.
C'est Cesare Lombroso.
Cesare, scusate. Non, Sigele, donc c'est un Turinois, non?
Non, Sigele, non.
Non?
C'est du centre de l'Italie, je pense.
Ah, mais un discepolo, non? C'est un disciple.
Oui, ils travaillent ensemble.
Bon, il y a pas mal de questions. Bon, ça montre l'intérêt, effectivement, de la conférence. Vas-y.
Oui, ok.
En anglais, hein, si tu veux.
Je pense que je vais passer de l'anglais au français. On va faire un peu de mélange. No, of course, there is an influence about of Lombroso on Le Bon. So I suggest you to visit the Lombroso Museum in Turin. And I suggest it to everybody. That's just incredible. That's really something that is worth the trip for the reasons he was talking about. And we find many Lombrosian elements in Gustave Le Bon, from the mesuration of heads, of
anthropometric,
exactly, to the concept itself of character, which is very, very rapidly present in Le Bon's writings. It is. I'd like to say on the side that I employed today a lot of there are not really distinction in one's way of thinking. So if I made some words seem to be the same with others, that's Gustave Le Bon, who is trying to develop some scientific concepts by employing different items from different disciplines of its time. And that's, I think, the point, because he never talks about his sources. He names Sigele and Tarde only to say that they only studied bad fools, bad crowds. They only studied the criminal crowds. And they didn't notice that crowds can be horrible, but they can also be heroic, because they are ethically unbounded. They pose to themselves no limits. But that's the only reference. So there is an interesting Italian work which is also published in which is by Michela Nacci, who suggests that among Italian Scuola Lombrosiana, French Psychologie collective, Gabriel Tarde, Gustave Le Bon, etc., Rossi in Italia, they all claimed the other to be copying them. They probably all copied one another. So it's really difficult, it's really hard to understand who is copying who. There is no doubt that Le Bon's, the interest of Le Bon is not the originality in some specific items. Even if when Freud has to talk about collective psychologies, he says the notion of primitive unconscious is the original concept proposed by Le Bon, so that's quite an authority. But I think that we would misunderstand Gustave Le Bon if we thought that the point is finding something original. Psychologie de crowd, Psychologie de fool is a mixture between some things that had already been written, so Sigele, Tarde, etc., and his studies about biology, about the spinal cord, and of course those studies too were not original, because he had not performed physical experiments on bodies. So he's a very particular writer who reads a lot of things. He's really a Renaissance man in the end of 19th century. He reads a lot of things, he puts all of them together, hoping to unveil the secrets of the universe. So that's of course, that's paranoid, but that's what you want to do. He wants to understand human civilization starting from how stars were born, and of course the evolution of beings, the evolution of vertebrates. So what's fascinating is, from one side, the goal of constructing a system which helps together psychology, sociology, philosophy, history, biology, evolution. Okay, that's the systematic goal, which is fascinating, I think, much more than the originality, because of course you're right. Sigele, everything he says has already been said. It has not been put together in a sentence.
C'est une synthèse, c'est ça, c'est capacité de synthèse. Donc
that's what they say. That's the other thing. He has a great capacity of synthesis. So he writes Psychologie the Fool, and it becomes, it's very well written, it's very effective, but
it's a pamphlet.
It's a pamphlet, but he's also the head of Bibliothèque de Philosophie Scientifique de Flammarion, which is the most successful editions. So he's very good at filling the air and writing something, and that's his handbook, we would say. Okay, so that's that. But that's not only that, that's also the fact that he believes that he can link spinal cord studies to understanding socialism.
Interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, in a, of course, exaggerated and impossible way. Other questions? Okay, about the sources. You asked about the bird. I don't know the source of the bird, but in another point, she says the same thing about the frog. The frog can walk even if you cut her head, and that I've seen that it is very common in scientific literature of the time. So if we want to trace the sources, we should look for the frog.
The duck too, no?
He talks about the duck too, yes.
Because that thinking was repeated by Conrad Lawrence, who made observations, ethological observation of birds and so on. There's a film actually where he looks at birds flying and so on. But this is after this.
Yes, after this.
Mais on peut regarder les sources de Lawrence, peut-être pour trouver.
Ah, peut-être indirectement, ouais.
Mais je pense que non, je pense que c'est intéressant, mais je pense que dans un point de vue scientifique, les études éthologiques de Le Bon n'ont pas eu une influence importante. Ils sont ces études de psychologie collective.
Mais à propos des sources, c'est peut-être un moyen de
ils ont peut-être les mêmes sources.
Voilà, c'est ça l'idée.
C'est ça. Mais en fait, de temps en temps, source, c'est en fait, c'est comme maintenant. On discute.
Ouais.
Il y a une personne qui écrit et les autres disent ah oui, c'est ça. Mais en même temps,
il n'y a pas la même notion de copyright en plus de disons de propriété intellectuelle. En plus, ça c'est une question.
C'est ça.
C'est toujours le problème aujourd'hui. Surtout avec l'Internet et la déposition des présentations sur Zoom, qui appartient à
En tout cas, pour ce qui concerne le moelle épinard, etc., ma suggestion, c'est de lire L'inconscient cérébral de Gauchet, de Marcel Gauchet. Marcel Gauchet et sa femme, qui était une historienne de la psychiatrie, ont étudié l'histoire de la psychiatrie française, et ils ont beaucoup travaillé sur ça. Ils n'ont pas vu le link avec la psychologie collective. Mais ils ont travaillé sur cette notion d'automatisme, etc. Donc, il y a Charcot, bien sûr, mais il y a aussi l'école allemande qui était en train d'étudier le moelle épinaire. Donc, c'est un peu compliqué. Ma suggestion, c'est de lire Gauchet, qui c'est très bien. Bien sûr. C'est un livre de 1994, je pense. Ah, je ne suis pas sûr. Your question. That's a tricky question because you say, c'est quoi le génie de la foule? Et bien sûr, in a certain sense, il n'y a pas de génie de la foule. The crowd, the strength of the crowd is to be conservative, is not to create. So let me explain. Le Bon's idea is that every living being must evolve, but it has to evolve slowly.
Yeah.
And the crowd understands irrationally, unconsciously understand the reason of the things being as they are. And so they don't trust reformers, they don't trust those who want to make a revolution. They defend tradition, and they go on very slowly.
A repository of values of
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. But we should reverse your question.
Yeah.
Because the point is the artist, the writer, the philosopher, which we think to be something different from the crowd. Le Bon says they are simply transforming in works of art the instances of the crowd, the instances of the people.
Yeah.
So it is not the crowd. The
instances of the masses.
The instances of not exactly the masses. The mass, the crowd is, if you want, the l'epitome, the excess,
okay.
The higher point. But they are transforming, yes, the ideas of the masses, of the popular masses. Yeah. So the instances, the values, the ideas of the popular masses are transformed in artworks, in writings from the writers and the artists. So it's not the fool who creates something. Of course, it can also create something, but normally the role of the masses is to preserve. It is the artists which are an epiphenomenon of the masses. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, I agree, but I remember in my old lecture on the Bon, and about the question of the language. Is language a collective creation? What is the nature of the language? Language is a genius of people, a genius of the nation. The genius is related to genius, collective genius. Can we consider language a sort of creation of the crowd?
Yeah, there are a lot of pages discussing language.
Yeah, I remember that. I was astonished by pages because.
So yes, of course we can.
Yeah,
but also because, of course, language studies were the studies through which the myth of Indo-Europeans arrived in culture. Yeah. So, of course, it was very important. He discussed languages, as you know. But yes, of course, it's a creation of the masses, but it's a very slow creation. So it cannot be created by the crowd because the crowd is temporary.
Okay. But the question is not the yeah, but the question is the capacity to perform something. In this case, the capacity of the mass is to create. No? Yeah,
history is okay. From the point of view of Le Bon, history is created by masses. Yeah. Is created by crowds because they have no bounds, because they do not want to preserve their safety, their personal safety, yeah. And so they make big changes in history. They make revolution, etc. At the same time, if you ask me what's the genie, so what's the intelligence, that's slow creation.
Yeah. But it's his creation.
Of course. He's an historian of art. He studies how art passes from the Egypt to India to Persia, and these slight changes, and then he sees if this cultural heritage can or cannot adapt to new countries. So Persia is where Greek civilization exploded and not the other places. Mm-hmm. That's but you need centuries in order to see that.
Sure.
And that's the thing that I find more funny, because Le Bon repeats that you need centuries, that you need thousands of time, and then he makes a pedagogy where the changes can happen in 6 months. That's the problem, if you want, of this system of learning. But of course, what you're asking is this: yes, masses make the history happen because they make big changes, but the crowd seems to be revolutionary, but that's just surface. Yeah. Deep inside, they want to go enormously slow, and they are terrified of change.
Sure. Deeply concerned. Yeah. Thank you. About Darwin.
Darwin, yes, but I think that his explanations was great. French people, French intellectuals and scientists.
Yeah.
That's it. They read Darwin, but they are there is Lamarck, there is Buffon, etc. I think it would be much more easy. What I'm trying to understand are the links with behaviorism, with Pavlov, with Russian studies on instincts, reflexes. I think that's where we should be looking in order to understand this, not the Darwinists of the 20th century, because of course Le Bon has completely different ideas. They use Darwin in order to talk about social Darwinism. So yes. That's
It's conflated in fact completely.
That's the only thing there that they talk about Darwin from one side because everyone says Darwin is the best, so they have to see that to talk about Darwin because of its authority, and on the other side because it helps them develop what is, yes, I don't know who was asking about that, but a racist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Because that was the dominant.
Of course. Well, okay. It was
right up through the Second World War, in fact. Only Valois was still trying to identify the number of races that made up Europe, and by cranial types. And that was the question. Race was an analytical category.
Absolutely.
It wasn't something you tried to demonstrate. It was something you used to understand, which of course there's a complete rupture now in anthropology and various in biology with that idea, because the concept of race, in fact, race itself, most biological anthropologists that I'm aware of, not all, dismiss it. They say it's not even defined. Their origin, they say, is probably Italian, but it has no really good definition of it. It has this idea of glassine, maybe, but what does that mean? It's clearly race is bigger than that. So race is no longer a question. It's in fact been abandoned as a concept. It's not a biological concept anymore.
Yeah.
And if you talk about it, when I have to lecture on that concept, I talk about geographic variance, which means you just have physical traits that blend and merge as you move across geographic space. So it's no longer an analytical category, but the concept still exists in people's heads, but they would never use it anymore, except for some extremists.
In the spinal.
Yes, well, there are some. They call them scientific racists, and there's quite a powerful movement in the sense that they promulgate their ideas on the internet very easily. They write little books. They perform bad statistics, and they have very strange analytical categories and things, but they exist, and they actually attend meetings and things in psychology as well. And they believe in things like IQ, for example. And that's something that was kind of my question for, is this the origin of these ideas like IQ? There's some sort of intellectual quotient.
Absolutely, yes. There is
the translation.
There is the weight of the brain.
Yeah.
Gorillas. Okay, I don't know. Probably I won't tell this, but there is this point. I mean, there is he wages I won't make examples, but there is the wage of brains from gorillas in the different races. So that's definitely IQ, and people from lower races cannot arrive to certain performance. And that's funny because you say that was the scientific paradigm. That's partly true, of course, and all you say is extremely interesting, but we should keep in mind that Le Bon is a fanatist. From the point of view of racism, he's completely, he's the far right of racism in those times. He's the far right in French colonialists, because he's against the idea of colonizing Africa in order to civilize the peoples, because he says they are so low that we cannot civilize them. You should not mix with them. So that's extreme. And that's interesting because it is so extreme that it doesn't fit with his thought. Because then he says there are no historical races. There is the French race. And of course, the French race is not a historical, it has, I don't know, 700 years.
That's I'll just continue speaking in English. Is that
sure.
That idea, I find that very offensive, actually. From an intellectual perspective, this notion that you take a European nation state and you attach race to it. So French race, English race, British, or Italian race, because of course that's historical.
No, Italian race there was not.
There was no.
There was no. There was no.
It's a nonsense.
There was.
Well, they are nonsense because it changes through time. So when you draw your maps of where these people live, they realize they're doing this.
Okay, I might answer to you in Le Bon's terms, but then I would give the impression of me defending an horrible ideology. So I don't know if you want me to do that. But Le Bon would say only English race actually exists because the peoples living in Great Britain has had the time to merge together. In France, there are Bretons, Normans, etc., which are almost on the verge of becoming a race. And this says, he says, some centuries. In Italy, of course, it didn't happen. In Germany, it's complicated. So
1870s, yeah.
it's also funny because he has Britain as a model, just like Montesquieu, just like the French liberals. But of course, that's in a really horrible. We might even discuss if it is interesting. I think it's very interesting to study Gustave Le Bon, not only despite these horrible things, but also because of these horrible things, because for what is happening, I mean, in the world, I think it is in Italy, especially, it is extremely important to know well this ideology. But of course, we might discuss. That's one of the reasons for which Le Bon has not been as studied as Gabriel Tart, etc., because in some elements it is difficult to read.
Yeah, because there's a stream of thinking here and certain others as well as this notion of chosen people, master race. And again, the origins of that are incredibly old because they come from some sort of ethnic reflex almost. We are this, and these other people, they're other things. They're very different from us. We are civilized, they are not. So anything that's associated with the uncivilized, we don't even study because it's irrelevant.
But he spends half of his life studying those civilizations. He spends 2 years in India. He spends, okay, India, it's different things, but he spends years in Arabia, etc. And that's the interesting thing. And he creates an intellectual system about how reflexes are acquired, which easily applies to every living being. So which destroys the racist ideology, which is the very core of his political idea.
Manon, peut-être d'autres questions aussi? Non, vous avez...
Oui, j'avais une question sur les sciences sociales qui se développent plus ou moins au même moment, avec cette distinction que fait Le Bon entre d'un côté la personnalité individuelle et l'esprit collectif, qui se traduit biologiquement entre le cerveau et la moelle épinière. J'ai l'impression que ça reconduit quand même un peu une vieille antithèse entre individu et société, qui justement à cette époque-là est vraiment remise en question par les études des sciences sociales, et je pense notamment à la fin du 19e siècle à des auteurs aux États-Unis comme William James ou comme John Dewey par exemple après qui intègrent les sciences sociales dans l'étude de la psychologie pour montrer que, y compris l'esprit individuel et la rationalité qui serait pure de toute collectivité, en fait, finalement, n'existe pas puisque l'esprit lui-même est un produit social, un produit de coutume, etc. Et du coup, voilà, je me demandais quelle était la prise en compte par Le Bon des sciences sociales, parce qu'on a l'impression quand même qu'il fait une antithèse entre une psychologie individuelle et une psychologie collective, et finalement, où serait la place pour une psychologie sociale.
Oui. Alors, c'est pas exactement mon domaine, mais en premier lieu, je dirais pas qu'il y a une division aussi radicale entre la psychologie individuelle et la psychologie sociale. Ça, c'est exactement le but de la psychologie collective. Si on l'appelle psychologie collective, c'est pourquoi le but, c'est d'utiliser le domaine de la psychologie individuelle pour comprendre les faits sociaux, pour comprendre la société. Donc, c'est la différence méthodologique avec la sociologie de Kahn, qui veut utiliser qui veut partir par le social pour retourner à l'individu. Le Bon veut partir par l'individu et appliquer l'idée and switch to English and use the image of the individual mind and translate it to groups in order to understand them. Of course, you can't translate all the individual mind because you don't have the brain, you only have a spinal cord, but I would not say difference society individual. I would say you use from an intellectual point of view, you use the tools of individual psychology in order to understand the social.
Et pourtant, il dit que dans la psychologie des foules, plus rien d'individuel ne subsiste, que ce soit la rationalité, que la logique, que ce soit la vérité.
Ouais, mais ça c'est la question. Ce qui arrive à la foule, c'est quelque chose qui est dedans l'individu. L'individu a aussi l'inconscient, a aussi.
Partie collective.
Exactement. C'est l'inconscient de l'individu. Mon impression, c'est que la foule, pour Le Bon, c'est une façon de voir grandir, comme sur un écran, l'inconscient de l'individu. It's like under the glass under I don't know how you call it, the microscope. Is that exactly? Because the crowd is a bigger individual, which is different from, of course, from the individual, because the individual has reason. But does he? What I try to say is that at the end, even the individual normally works, acts, behaves like crowd. Anyway, you don't agree?
No.
Non,
I'm very
pour
interested.
moi, il y a vraiment des instruments d'analyse qui sont complètement différents, puisqu'il analyse l'individu malgré tout quand même en termes de possible rationalité, en termes de... Et parce que si on part du principe que tout est inconscient, que tout est fou, même l'individu, à ce moment-là, je ne vois même pas comment il y a une évolution quelque part ou un progrès possible.
Et ça, c'est mon point. Ça c'est ce dont je voulais parler. Comment on peut avoir un progrès si tout est inconscient?
Parce que même cette philosophie d'éducation, pour moi, elle est intrinsèquement conservatrice, puisque si le but, c'est de faire passer dans le conscient de l'inconscient collectif, il n'y a aucune... Enfin, si je pense à d'autres théories d'éducation à la même époque, il n'y a aucune prise en compte de l'impulsion, par exemple, de l'enfant, enfin
de quoi?
Je ne sais pas comment on pourrait dire en français, impulse, enfin, de partir de l'enfant, par exemple, et de ses propres...
Pulsion.
Oui, c'est propre. Alors, c'est pas, je suis pas sûre que pulsion, c'est très bien. Mais...
Ouais.
Sauf qu'il arrive à dire, qu'il faut laisser l'enfant le plus libre possible. Dans le 1910, il y a un bouquin concernant l'éducation américaine qui sort en Belgique et il publie une nouvelle version de sa psychologie de l'éducation pour introduire un chapitre dédié à la psychologie américaine, où il parle de ça, du fait que les lycées américains, etc., laissent le majeur niveau possible de liberté et de choix à l'enfant. Et ça c'est bien parce que si l'enfant est intéressé à ce qu'il fait, l'éducation marche beaucoup mieux.
C'est comme les écoles Montessori.
C'est ça.
Oui, je pensais à la même chose.
Mais c'est dans un auteur qui est complètement conservatif. Ça ne marche pas.
C'est vraiment paradoxal.
Mais vous allez le lire, tu vas le lire, mais c'est vraiment incroyable de lire ce chapitre.
De 1910, ça s'appelle comment?
C'est toujours la psychologie de l'éducation.
Ah oui,
c'est une deuxième édition de la psychologie de l'éducation. Elle s'appelle toujours comme ça. Sur Gallica, etc., on ne trouve que ça. Normalement, on trouve la version avec le chapitre concernant l'éducation américaine. Et en tout cas, je ne connais pas trop bien les sciences sociales américaines, et donc je ne veux pas m'exprimer sur combien Le Bon a reçu les sciences sociales américaines. Mais d'autre côté, il y a des études très intéressantes que je peux vous donner sur comment les sciences sociales américaines ont reçu Le Bon. La théorie, c'est que c'est le lieu où ils ont eu plus d'influence directe dans un point de vue scientifique. Et il y a une étude sur ça, donc je peux...
On a une question. Comment dire ça en fait Le Bon est à l'origine d'une légende noire très forte, très, très durable.
Yeah.
Is it at the origin of the black legend?
Black legend. Yeah.
In your point of view, is Le Bon a victim of a sort of misreading?
What is the black legend?
A black legend is because it's a livre de chevet de Mussolini, livre de chevet de Hitler is a black legend. Yeah, it's a real black legend about Le Bon, reception Le Bon. This kind of Le Bon or the Psychologie of the Fool, this book. But your point,
That's very interesting. Okay, from one point of view, definitely yes. In France, I can't prove, I can't find the quotation I had found when I started studying Le Bon, where I had found that Bourdieu and Boudon insulted the other by giving the Le Bon to the other. So, of course, there was of course there is a black legend about Le Bon, and of course this led people to study Le Bon less than it should be read, because it has been so much influenced. I believe it is very important to study him, and even now when there is, okay, I have some things to say. There has been la psychologie collective en général, it has been underestimated for years.
Yeah.
Because it had lost. Sociology had won, psychologie collective had lost from a scientific point of view, and so it was partly forgot, not studied as much as probably should. But now there is a strong revival of collective psychology. People are studying, making conferences, but they normally study Gabriel Tarde, they normally study Sigele, they don't study Le Bon, because, I mean, I don't think he's less interesting, but we might discuss. Gabriel Tarde, of course, is extraordinary, etc. But the point is a political point. He is considered the reason for which people have forgot political psychology, collective psychology, because he was a proto-fascist. Then he's a parliamentarist. I don't think that he's in favor of fascism because he's against the leader. Because as there is no free will, he's completely against the idea of one person governing. But of course, he's conservative. Yes, he doesn't publish anything against Dreyfus because he's the head-in-chief of the Bibliothèque Scientifique de Flammarion, and there are Dreyfus Arts inside, but in his private letters, he's completely anti-Dreyfus Art. No, ce que je voulais dire, I wanted to say that, okay, he's a victim of a black legend, but he used that when he was alive, because all of his life he said, academy doesn't want me, because I am too problematic, because I am too original, and France universities are too conservative.
Anti-academic.
Anti-academic, and he used that in order to create, he has this dîner he made every month with some of the most important people in intellectual and political and military world in France, discussing the items. So he was deeply inside the réseau, the intellectual and political réseau. But he claimed to be the victim of, and then, yeah, somehow what he said happened after his death. So.
Donc aujourd'hui, on peut le relire différemment. Donc il y a un retour, il y a un état des lieux, pardon, un état de l'art aussi dans des nouveaux études sur Le Bon. Il y a un renouveau des études, si j'ai bien compris en fait. En France aussi.
Il y a un retour à la psychologie collective.
Ça, oui.
Ça, c'est clair. Pas trop à Le Bon. Maintenant, les choses les meilleures concernant Le Bon ont été écrites il y a 40 ans. C'est pas maintenant. Oui, c'est Benoît Marpeau, etc. Ils sont les choses les meilleures qui ont été écrites, les plus complètes.
Dans le monde anglophone aussi.
Bon.
Donc, il y a pas...
Dans le monde anglophone, il y a beaucoup de... je peux vous donner des noms. Il y a beaucoup d'attention à la dimension de crowds. There are books talking about the forgotten side of sociology, forgotten, which is crowd. So the attention is not to Gustave Le Bon, the attention is to crowd. And of course, Gustave Le Bon, but there the answer is yes, Gustave Le Bon is watched without prejudice in Anglo-Saxon studies. They don't study him, but they use him to study the crowd. Ben oui, il y a des bouquins qui sont en train de sortir, je pense à Grenoble, il y a un groupe de recherche qui travaille sur la psychologie des foules où ils sont sortis beaucoup de choses concernant le bon aussi. Elle est un Beauvau, et je pensais à elle, c'est pas Grenoble, mais c'est l'université de Haute-Savoie. Je pensais à elle.
Oui.
Il est italien. Hein? Franche-Comté, c'est ça. J'oublie tout le temps le nom de département en France. Elle est italienne formellement, mais elle travaille en France depuis longtemps. Il a recueilli des études concernant la foule, etc. Donc, il y a beaucoup de choses sur le bon qui sortent aussi. Mais ce n'est pas votre impression, même. Pas autant que concernant Gabriel Tarde, concernant...
Là, c'est beaucoup Lombroso, Sigelé.
Lombroso, Sigelé, l'école italienne, oui.
Il y a déjà Tarde dans l'école criminelle.
Ils sont beaucoup plus acceptés, je trouve. Il y a beaucoup moins d'embarras.
Elle, justement, elle essaie de faire le parti. Parce qu'en fait, elle dit que c'est la psychologie collective, globalement, qui a connu les gens noirs à cause de Le Bon. Ouais. Et elle dit que, justement, au début, que ce soit chez Lombroso ou chez Sigelé, il y avait plutôt un côté progressiste, parce que le but était de montrer que s'il y avait effectivement une influence de la foule sur l'individu, alors on devait repenser la notion de responsabilité au niveau criminel, au niveau juridique. Et que du coup, qu'en fait, on avait tendance à associer la psychologie des foules au conservatisme de Le Bon et qu'il y avait eu une préhistoire, entre guillemets, de la psychologie des foules qui est beaucoup moins marquée par ce caractère des races, ce caractère...
C'est ça. C'est la faute à Le Bon si on a oublié la psychologie collective.
Par contre, je ne dirais pas qu'elle a investi Le Bon, mais je dirais qu'au contraire, elle essaie de faire la distinction entre...
Les bons et les autres. Oui, voilà. Le bon, les méchants et les bons.
Exact.
Non, c'est intelligent quand même.
Oui, parce que Lombroso, etc., ils sont devenus l'école lombrosienne est devenue socialiste dans un certain point. Donc, il y a une tradition progressiste, effectivement, si on considère ça progressiste. Après, il y a Sorel.
Pour faire un exemple de banalisation de la pensée lebonienne, donc autour de l'étude de Marc Bloch sur la rumeur, qui est une étude expérimentale donc, sur la rumeur dans les tranchées de la Première Guerre mondiale, qui sort en 1922. Donc, elle cite pas les bons, mais en fait, de façon tout à fait normale, donc la psychologie collective, c'est la notion centrale pour comprendre donc, le phénomène de fake news, donc de la rumeur, dans les tranchées. C'est Marc Bloch. Mais
en 1922, c'est pas encore. C'est après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale que c'était.
Après la première, donc il est témoin donc de ces mouvements, de rumeurs en fait qui se passent dans les tranchées. Il écrit c'est une étude de 1922. Ça fait réflexion d'un historien sur les fausses rumeurs de la guerre. Vous regardez les sources, et toutes ces sources vont dans le sens, pas de Durkheim. Alors qu'on dit toujours que Bloch donc, est lié à Durkheim, à sociologie. Ils vont dans le sens de la psychologie des foules.
Oui, mais ce que je veux dire, c'est qu'en 1922, il n'y a pas encore cette légende noire dont vous parlez.
Alors, la légende noire, oui, c'est clair.
Aux États-Unis, en 1922, on parle de la
tout à fait. Donc, c'était quelque chose qui était banalisé dans les études des sciences humaines, quoi. Ça faisait partie d'un bagage d'un historien qui s'est tourné vers les sciences sociales. Il ne restait pas un historien qui s'est tourné vers les sciences sociales donc, en 1922, il trouvait les bons sur son chemin, forcément. Et il n'y avait pas, justement, la légende noire est née après la prise de pouvoir. Donc, et je pense qu'il faudrait voir l'usage que Mussolini dit de faire, donc, explicitement, je pense.
Il dit qu'ils aiment beaucoup la psychologie de foule de Le Bon.
Staline aussi.
Theodore Roosevelt aussi. Theodore Roosevelt aussi.
Roosevelt aussi, oui, bien sûr. Donc, il y a effectivement...
Atatürk aussi.
Atatürk. C'est assez écuménique. Bon, merci beaucoup. Je ne sais pas si vous avez encore, ça a été très riche. Un vrai séminaire.
Merci.
Alors, je pense aussi, merci à tous ceux qui sont
merci vraiment
à distance.